Wars have been a constant part of human societies since the beginning of human history. Wherever and whenever there is conflict of interest, there is always people fighting for them. Wars tear apart lives, families, towns, whole countries, people fall dead, and most of those end up forgotten or as numbers in the news, from the soldier on the frontier to the doctor trying to save the many wounded people. Keeping record of such events is generally a job for history books or newspapers. However, we find that other genres, as letters, diaries, and poems, also pose as good source of information. When it comes to war poems, we could talk about at least two different perspectives: the soldier poet, who is in the frontier, generally writing in the trenches on the aftermath of battles, and that of the civilian, who most of the time does not.
Poem 409. They dropped like flakes, they dropped like stars, like petals from a rose, when suddenly across the June a wind with fingers goes. They perished in the seamless grass, no eye could find the place, but God can summon every face of his repellus list.
The poem shown earlier is one of Emily Dickinson's war poems that recreates a battle scene in which the soldiers drop it like flakes, drop it like stars, drop like petals from a rose, until they finally perished in the seamless grass, and their souls are claimed by God no matter the side they fought, as God can summon every face of his repellus list. Dickinson was around her 30s when the American Civil War struck. Moreover, she was at a safe distance from the war, since the battles at that time usually took place in battlefields far from the cities. In her poem 827, Dickinson writes, "The only news I know is bulletins all day from immortality."
Being a woman who spent most of her life locked inside her room, Dickens wrote her war poems based on what she was told about war or from newspapers and letters of friends who were somehow involved more directly to the war. She exchanged many letters with her friend Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who was a commander of the 1st South Carolina Regiment.
Charles Simic is yet another example of poetry who experienced war from a civilian perspective. He was on his early ages at the time the Second World War was happening, living in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, where he was born in 1938. Yugoslavia was then invaded by the Axis forces on 60th of April 1941, resulting in a period of brutal regime. We can see traces of the war on his poem Prodigy, which narrates a part of Simic's childhood and his naive consciousness in regard to the war context around him. The poem starts with, "I grew up bent over a chessboard," which is one of the main themes in the poem. The narrator then says that all my cousins look worried, suggesting that the cousins were probably older and more conscious about the war.
On the fifth line, a description of the setting starts to be built. It was a small house near a Roman graveyard. Planes and tanks shook its window panes. This scene shows how close to the war environment the narrator really was, as even the movement of planes and tanks made the house tremble. The poem then shifts back to the chessboard as the narrator describes it. The paint had almost chipped off the black pieces. The white king was missing and had to be substituted for. Once again, the theme swiftly changes from the chessboard to the war, when he says that, "I'm told, but do not believe, that summer I witnessed men hung from telephone poles." This could be related to the mass hangings made in Yugoslavia during the Axis occupation, in which many civilians were killed with the excuse of ethnic cleansing.
The poem ends making an implied comparison between chess and war. In chess, too, the professor told me, the masters play blindfolded, the great ones, on several boards at the same time. Here he is saying that chess masters play blindfolded to test their skills, while the great ones, the generals and politicians, also play blindfolded and on several boards, meaning that during war times they play with the pawns, the soldiers, not really knowing what happens to them. Moreover, wars such as the Second World War, which was the one happening in the poem, had battles fought in different fronts throughout the globe. Hence, we have the allusion to the masters playing on several boards.
Just as Dickinson and Simic, many other poets wrote about wars and battles from a faraway perspective, just based on information which arrived at their hands and ears. On the other side, we have also many poets who wrote from their own experience in war, either fighting on the battlefield, helping wounded people, or even those who were very close to the catastrophe having their lives affected more directly. Wilfred Owen was an English poet who is known as one of the leading poets of the First World War. He fought in the war as a soldier and unfortunately was killed in the action in 1918 at the age of 25. He is known for his very realistic description of the horrors of war. Owen chooses by many times to show more frontline images from the war, recreating scenes of the day-to-day anxieties within the trenches. In Exposure, Owen brings several images related to war routine.
Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knives us. Wearied, we keep awake because the night is silent. Low, drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens. On this first stanza, there are descriptions of the nights in the trenches, how uneasy the soldiers were because of the silence brought by night, how focused they had to be, and alert for potential ambushes. The stanza then ends with "but nothing happens," again bringing the idea of expectations, anxieties, and fear of the unknown. The line "but nothing happens" repeats itself by the end of stanzas 3 and 4, after a break in stanza 2, which ends in "what are we doing here?", giving the idea of time passing, of waiting and thinking about war.
Rupert Brooke was an English poet who is very well known by his war sonnets written during the First World War. He was commissioned into the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve as a temporary sub-lieutenant. He also died during war and very young as Owen, at the age of 27 in 1915. His death took place on a ship due to a disease contracted from a bite of an infected mosquito. The most known of his works are The Dead and The Soldier, which deals at the same time with the horrors of war, the sacrifices many made for their countries, and the glory that may arrive from all that chaos. On the poem The Soldier, he talks about how his heart has always beaten so stark for England, even at the peril of possibly dying in the battlefield. In the first stanza, he states, "If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed."
Moreover, this idea of a foreign piece of land being forever England refers to the idea of his very nationalist body turning into dust, nourishing that rich earth with an English richer dust, and that he should only be remembered for his glorious death. The Dead. Blow out your bugles over the rich dead. There is none of these so lonely and poor of old, but dying has made us rarer gifts than gold. This laid the world away, pour out the red sweet wine of youth, gave up the years to be, of work and joy and that unhoped serene, that men call age, and those who would have been their sons they gave their mortality. Blow, bugles, blow, they brought us for our death. Holiness lacked so long, and love and pain. Honor has come back as a king to earth, and paid his subjects with a royal wage, and nobleness walks in our ways again, and we have come into our heritage. On the Dead, Brooke talks about immortality, sacrifice, and honoring the dead, about how, thanks to the many dead who fought for their country, the future generations had a chance to thrive, and also how some very nationalist ideologies, which were missing a while, had finally come back to England.
Yet another interesting aspect of this poem is the possible intertextuality with the poem Beat Beat Drums of Walt Whitman. The first line on all three stanzas in Whitman's poem starts the same: "Beat beat drums, blow bugles blow," like in the following stanza: "Beat beat drums, blow bugles blow, through the windows, through doors, burst like a ruthless force into the solemn church and scatter the congregation, into the school where the scholar is studying. Leave not the bridegroom quiet, no happiness must he have now with his bride, nor the peaceful farmer any peace, ploughing his field or gathering his grain. So fierce you wire and pound your drums, so shrill bugles now. The first lines of both stanzas in Brooke's poem, "Blow out your bugles over the rich dead," and "Blow, bugles, blow, they brought us for our death," respectively, repeat this same image of bugles being blown. Both signals announce something which is about to happen, but whilst the first announces the war to come, the second indicates some battle about to begin. An interesting fact: after Brooke's death, Wilfred Owen wrote the inscription on the stone of his grave, where it reads, "My subject is war, and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity."
Back to Whitman, during the American Civil War, he worked as a clerk in Washington, D.C. For 3 years he visited soldiers during his spare time, dressing wounds and giving solace to the injured. Such experiences resulted in The Wound Dresser, a poem from his 1865 poetry collection, Drum Taps. The poem tells the story of a war veteran who is asked by children to tell tales from the war times. Although Whitman did not fight in the war, his experience was somewhat close to it. The character of the veteran is an obvious representation of Whitman's time in the field hospitals, as in the passage. "Bearing the bandages, water, and sponge, straight and swift to my wounded I go."
The veteran remembers each soldier as unique rather than just a bunch of wounded people. He even characterized them for their wounds. "I dress the perforated shoulder, the foot with the bullet wound, cleans the one with the gnawing and putrid gangrene." The main idea in this poem is that it talks about war experience without recreating battle scenes, but choosing to show the aftermath of them.
The main intention with this video was to make a brief comparison between the different sorts of experiences some poets had related to war and how that is reflected upon their poems and writings. No matter if we are reading Dickinson's poems, Whitman's or Owen's, in all of those it's clear that war affected all people in a larger or smaller degree. We can notice that people who were not involved directly with war used to talk mostly about it on general, more idealistic terms, like Dickinson, who only knew what was told to him, or in the case of Simic, who talked about war through the eyes of a child, himself as a child. A few memories or things people told him about his childhood during war, where, while he was playing unaware with his chessboard, bigger battles were unfolding around him. On this other side, we have poets like Whitman, Owen, and Brooke, who risked their lives, and as it happened with the last two, lost their lives in service for their country. We see that they tend to be more descriptive, bringing the horrific reality of the battlefields and of the trenches, while seeing many comrades perishing around them, many young men dying so that the future generations could prosper. Furthermore, it is with this very melancholic tone that the last three poets mentioned work mostly on their poems. Whitman bringing the image of a veteran who delves into the memories of his fellow soldiers dying in his arm and of the tenderness he has for them, while Owen and Brooke tend to focus more on the lives of men during war and their eventual death, sometimes making existentialist reflections on the meaning of war.